believe it's time to start the national, full-blown conversation about reparations.
An emotional turbulence that only reparations.
Thank you very much. Senator Sanders.
It seems that every few years, such as in the 2020 Democratic primary, the subject of reparations is brought up, specifically reparations for slavery. Politicians often posture about how slavery was one of the worst evils in human history, and how we have an ethical obligation to pay back people who have been wronged in the past. But I feel like often these arguments aren't looked at closely. So today I'll be going through a few of the pro-reparations arguments and, spoiler alert, giving reasons why I think an egalitarian-minded left-wing person should not be supportive of reparations in general. As a white liberal, I just really feel like my perspective is important here, so I figured I'd make a whole video about it. This video will be specifically discussing arguments for reparations for things that were done generations ago. I'm enormously supportive of, for example, reparations for the internment of Japanese Americans after World War II, because that was done immediately after the crime was committed. Another small clarification here. I often see opponents of reparations making arguments about public backlash, or whether or not giving money to certain communities is actually going to help those communities.
What I think of is Zimbabwe in 2000, where black militias marched onto white farms, said, rightly, you took this from us, we're going to take it back. Right? They literally did that at gunpoint. And what happened? It completely destroyed the economy of the country.
I also see arguments like, how would we judge the exact amount of the payment? Or how can we tell who belongs to a certain discriminated minority?
What do you do with, for example, Barack Obama, whose father was black and not from the United States, and therefore not having history with slavery, and a mother who is white? Would his family receive slavery reparations?
I think that these are all good objections in their own right, but they don't address the fundamental moral issue of reparations, which is what I'm trying to do today. Let me begin by giving a few reasons that I think it would be right for a government to pay reparations. The first one is effective targeting. That is to say that if there is a minority group which has been the victim of discrimination, say internment in World War II, then that group probably requires specific types of aid that the government would be able to most efficiently supply to those people in the form of reparations. So for example, since black people have been the victim of redlining, it would have been enormously helpful for the government to immediately step in and provide assistance to buy homes, thereby most efficiently targeting those in need. Another major reason to pay reparations would be as a deterrent. If a government has to pay out $74 billion, or euros in this case, after committing an atrocity, it might be less likely to commit an atrocity in the future for fear that it will have to make the same payment again. Not that there aren't other reasons to not commit the Holocaust, and of course Allied intervention helped, but in the case of countries that remain independent after doing bad things, such as the US, the most likely path towards a deterrent would be reparations either mandated by a court or by a Congress. Now there's often a third reason given for why governments should pay reparations or fines in general, and that's the idea of just desert. So because the government has harmed somebody in the past, they have an ethical obligation to make that right. Now this is, I think, probably going to be the most contentious one because I disagree totally with this concept. There are two reasons for this. First of all, the government is to some extent different from private bodies in the fact that it's a representation of the will of the people, at least in Western liberal democracies. That is to say that it's difficult to fault the government for something because the government is ultimately just a representation of the entire population, or at least the voting population, meaning that culpability for slavery, for example, I think ultimately lies with all of the people who elected congressional representatives who fought to keep it. For that reason, it seems rather difficult to me to say that the government should pay reparations when the ultimate responsibility for the acts lies with a lot of people. Second, it seems to me that the government has a somewhat unique role in society in that it is meant to serve the society as a whole. Therefore, it doesn't seem reasonable to expect it to have the same legal rights and responsibilities as other actors. In general, I think we should measure the success of a government policy by whether or not it benefits people. Reparations style policy might or might not benefit people. If it does, it should be pursued anyway. If it doesn't, it shouldn't be pursued. And so I think just deserts doesn't give us a good metric for making society a better place. Now, just let that sit in your mind for a while as I go through these arguments, but then at the end of the video, we'll go back and measure each of the possible stances against how well it fulfills the criteria that I laid out here. Okay, wow, well, with 4 minutes of preamble out of the way, we can finally get to the arguments that I see occasionally made for reparations. The first one is rather simple. It argues that because certain minority groups have been discriminated against in the past. The government owes them reparations.
And by this, I mean that the Western establishment should take collective responsibility for meeting the reparatory justice needs of African heritage communities and indigenous peoples who were subjected to the criminality of the crimes of genocide and ecocide, which collectively constitute the Maangamizi, a Kiswahili term meaning the African Holocaust.
A small addendum is worth pointing out to this view. There are lots of atrocities throughout history, from the Romans sacking Gaul, to the destruction of Troy, Romans having slaves, Greeks having slaves, Egyptians having slaves. So a serious advocate of this view would have to advocate that the remnants of all of these groups have to pay reparations to the groups that were wronged by them, which seems rather obviously ridiculous. Now, somebody might object that actually only existing bodies should pay reparations. So since the Roman government doesn't exist anymore, whereas the United States government still exists, it should be that the United States government pays reparations to slaves, but the Roman government doesn't have to pay reparations to Gaul. There are a few major issues with this. First of all, a lot of weight is put on the continued existence of the US government. I mean, it's technically correct to say that, but in the sense that's morally important, there's not a single person who made the decision to keep slavery who's alive today. Only the government in the most abstract sense has a continuation from 1800s to now. But additionally, there's still lots of organizations that have very long histories of doing bad things. Just look at the Catholic Church, for example. This probably existed in one iteration or another, at least since the Crusades, which were without a doubt very bloody and had lots of atrocities committed during them. So would one realistically advocate that the church should now be paying out to the governments of Palestine? There's a second possible response, though. That's to say, well, of course, there were all of these atrocities far, far away in history, but as something becomes further away in history, it clearly matters less, so it's just bad faith for me to bring up these really distant examples. I would agree with this, but that's actually precisely the reason I think that reparations for things that are hundreds of years old don't make much sense either. It seems rather arbitrary to say that 2,000 years ago is too far away, but 200 years ago, no, that's just right. That's when we should really be paying reparations. Rather, a rule that makes much more sense is something like one generation, where the actual people who are harmed and benefited are the actual people who are going to be repaying reparations and receiving the reparations. The second possible argument, which I'll address briefly, is the idea that reparations should be given simply because a certain group is doing badly today, and not because of certain historical atrocities. Now, I don't think that there are many people who genuinely advocate this, but this is the type of rhetoric that you often hear when people are talking about reparations.
So if you were to bring the black share of wealth at least to the black share of the population, it would require an additional at least $10 trillion. And so the other kinds of programs or initiatives that we're talking about are not going to come anywhere close to trying to eliminate or eradicate a gap at that magnitude. And so that's why we need to turn to something like a reparations program, which is specifically aimed at building black assets to a level that would be comparable to the level of assets that are held by white Americans.
Let's note, first of all, what this argument is trying to prove. This argument is trying to prove that certain groups, such as black people in the US, have certain special rights to government services or government direct checks because of their current status today. But obviously, it just doesn't prove that conclusion. There are lots of groups that are doing badly in the status quo. There are plenty of poor people who are white, and so it just doesn't seem clear to me why we should be giving money to all black people and no poor white people. Rather, we should give money to all poor people, whether they be white or black. So for example, we should think about whether, according to this aim of helping those who are in most need, it would be more efficient to give money to LeBron James or to somebody who earns $20,000 a year but is white. Oh, and in case this isn't clear, that's just welfare, which I'm enormously supportive of, but it's definitely not reparations. So now onto the third stance, which is, I think, actually the most popular stance among intellectuals who support reparations. It's the idea that a certain group must both A, be the victim of historical discrimination, and B, have lasting negative effects on their well-being now because of that discrimination.
We're owed this money because of past federal policy, past state policy, robbed Black Americans opportunities to build wealth. and this had a negative impact on economic and social outcomes in our communities that we see and live with every day. And so if we really want to, one, repair the damage that's been caused and create a plan moving forward to help Black and Brown communities, we really do need a reparations package.
Note that simply having below average living conditions is not sufficient for this argument because that just gets us back to welfare. There are plenty of individual Black people who are living above average lives, so it seems that if you're just defining by average, they shouldn't get reparations. Rather, they would have to argue that those people would have lived even better lives had it not been for slavery and other historical atrocities. Okay, now I'm going to get myself really canceled, but it just isn't clear to me that slavery on the whole has been much worse for the current Black community than a world without slavery would have been. Assuming that there would have never been much immigration from African countries into North America because of course, the incredible racism at the time without slavery, it seems to me that the Black community might well have better standards of living than they would otherwise because of slavery nowadays. Note that none of this actually justifies slavery in general, because I think that obviously the effects on the slaves is so enormously terrible that it outweighs whatever good is done now. But because we're just talking about the quality of lives of people now with or without slavery, this argument becomes somewhat relevant. Also, this is far from a complete refutation for reparations, because there are plenty of other policies such as Jim Crow, which obviously had a net negative impact on the Black community. In any case, I don't think that this proves well that the case of, for example, Black Americans or Indigenous people is much different than the cases of much older things such as the destruction of Atlanta or even way back the destruction of Rome. It seems quite possible to me that the current descendants of Romans would have lived much better lives had their civilization continued to prosper rather than having Rome sacked by the Huns. Naturally, these things are actually quite hard to measure, but it's also quite hard to measure the exact impact that slavery had on the Black community. So given that we're living in an idealized world right now where we don't have to worry about these practical realities, it seems reasonable that the governments involved should all have to pay reparations. Again, a kind of ridiculous view. Okay, now time for my third controversial response. But I imagine most people on the left in general would say that it's a government failing to have people grow up in poverty without the opportunities that they have the right to. In fact, if we imagined a group today that had public school denied to them, or were allowed to starve to death or any of those things, we would be rightfully outraged. In fact, many of the reasons one would support reparations for Jim Crow laws are the same sort of reasons that one would support reparations for things like a lack of government services. Because in both cases, it's not like there's forcible confinement or something, as in the case of slavery, but there is a clear lack of things like economic, social, and political opportunities which ought to be provided to all citizens. So given that these things are reparationsable, if you will, it seems clear to me that a huge portion of people in poverty are at least at some point linked to a lack of government services, and therefore the government should be paying them all reparations. And oh wait, we're again back to the issue of welfare. Okay, so I can already anticipate the response that people are going to give, which is that slavery was obviously so much worse than a government not providing free schooling, that there should be more reparations paid for one thing than another, so even if we have welfare, certain people get more of it that we just call reparations. Now, obviously, it's just incredibly true that slavery is far worse than even the worst economic deprivation, but I do think that we have to remember we're not judging the historical atrocity by how atrocious it was at the time, because we're not giving reparations to people at the time. We're giving reparations to people many generations later. So instead we should be asking, how much does this affect people now? And given that there are both incredibly poor Black people and incredibly poor white people, it seems to me that it's fair to say both were quite negatively affected, perhaps to a similar extent, by previous government wrongs. So again, back to welfare. So I should now make true on the promise I made at the beginning and discuss whether or not reparations as a policy are effective in meeting the criteria that I laid out above. Again, specifically talking about reparations for things that are centuries old. So is this effective in terms of targeting? Well, I would say not, because actually there's enough spread within the Black community between those who are wealthy and those who aren't. that it'd be just more efficient to target all poor people as opposed to target all black people who now have enough different experiences that we're not actually all targeting the same thing. Next, do we think that this type of disincentive is going to effectively disincentivize governments from committing atrocities in the future? Well, I guess I don't think so. It seems unrealistic to me that governments are going to change what they're doing now because they're worried they're going to have to pay out reparations 250 years down the road. I mean, we already have climate change, and we aren't doing enough to meet the Paris targets, though it's probably going to have negative effects far sooner than 250 years from now. And although it might seem that just desserts is a good argument in this case, I don't think that that is a good criterion for judging government policy, for the simple reason that the government ought to be maximizing happiness. If I could make a final comment here, I think that many leftists have an impulse that intergenerational wealth transfer is highly problematic, that it doesn't give me any strong reason to own a huge amount of property just because my father or grandfather did. Yet this is exactly what you're advocating in terms of reparations. You're saying that because there's some debt that's owed to black people's grandfathers or great-grandfathers, that therefore that is then owed to them specifically. But that just doesn't make much sense to me. Naturally, the argument can be turned around, and one could say, yes, but also white people shouldn't own this because first of all, it's stolen, and second of all, lots of wealth is just being transferred down the generations. But I think in this case, simple possession gives a prima facie reason for ownership. In other words, even if nobody has rightful ownership of a piece of property, it seems to me that just taking that property away from the possessor at the moment incurs a cost that makes it not worthwhile prima facie, both in a financial, paying the police to go do stuff, and in an emotional, losing things is generally more harmful emotionally than the happiness derived from gaining them sense. Before I leave off, just so it doesn't seem like I'm Satan incarnate, I should explain what exactly I propose to do about things like the black-white wealth gap. Given all of the arguments I've presented in this video so far, it should be clear that I think the right thing to do is to give money and resources to those who are in need in general, regardless of their race. Now, it should be pointed out that this is going to be disproportionately beneficial to black people, because being disproportionately disadvantaged at the moment, they would also be disproportionately benefited by any program meant to help those who are poor. My hope is that given sufficient opportunities, the black wealth white gap and other racial wealth gaps would shrink and disappear. I just see no reason why the government should give more benefit to one person over another because of something that they couldn't control. Either, a white person's grandfather being just irresponsible with money, or the black person's grandfather or great-great-grandfather being a slave or a victim of Jim Crow. And that's how you know I'm anti-racist. I'll take the badge, Miss D'Angelo.